Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're just going to let a few minutes go by while we let people join. Watching those numbers creep up. So I think we can maybe get started. So welcome everybody to Glove Actually, Confident Decision Making in Art Handling. I do think this title is perhaps a contender for the Pun of the Year Award for 2023, but we'll see. My name is Greg Stewart. I am the Education Programs Manager at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, or CCAHA as we're called, and I use he, they pronouns. So a little bit about this webinar. While it seems pretty straightforward, there often seems like there's so many unwritten rules about art and artifact handling. And one of the biggest, of course, is gloves or no gloves. And if so, which gloves to use? So we're going to kind of walk you through the pros and cons today of the most widely used types of gloves, the newest research on their environmental impact, and the types of objects that can be handled with each. We said this program's great for emerging professionals, but we find that even if you have years of experience in the field, you still might have questions. So just some Zoom housekeeping stuff. You are in Zoom webinar, which means your video and audio are turned off, but you can ask questions or make comments to us using the chat feature. And this program is auto closed captioned in English, and you can turn on subtitles with the little CC button in the Zoom toolbar. So we'll have a presentation from our speaker today, who I'll introduce in a moment, followed by Q&A with you. So please feel free to ask any questions that might come up anytime during the program, and I will get to them. And this program is being recorded, and so we'll send out the recording as well as PowerPoint and some resources that we've shared in a follow-up email that will come after the program. And I want to also thank the National Endowment for the Humanities, the William Penn Foundation, and the Independence Foundation, who are making today's program possible. And Katie, if I could just ask you to advance to the next slide, please. So I just want to say a quick note about the organization I work for, the CCAHA. We are a regional conservation lab and preservation services facility. We're based in Philadelphia, but we work with organizations and clients all across the country. Our conservators treat paper-based objects like books, photographs, documents, artwork on paper, and more. And our preservation services staff work in the field, providing education programs like this one and helping institutions plan for the future of their collections. The center also offers a wide range of digitization services, as well as fundraising assistance, housing, framing, and more. And you can learn more about us and what we do at our website at ccaha.org. So with that, I want to turn it over to Katie Lowe, who is Preservation Specialist here at the CCAHA. In her position, Katie Lowe conducts on-site preservation needs and risk assessments and assists with preservation and emergency planning at cultural heritage organizations across the country. So welcome, Katie. And I'm just going to turn off my video and mute, and I'll come back on when it's time for Q&A.
All right, welcome everybody. It is such a pleasure to be here with all of you. My name is Katie, like Greg said. I'm a preservation specialist here at CCAHA, and my pronouns are she, her. All right, so let's dive in. I'm going to try to keep it to a tight 30 minutes as much as I possibly can. Just starting off real quick with our agenda so you have some idea of what to expect from our time together today. So before we do anything else, we're just going to go over some guiding principles that are really going to underpin everything that we learn about today. Then we'll sort of switch into glove types. So specifically, what types of glove options are we going to be analyzing today? Followed by what criteria? So how are we judging them for their appropriateness for object handling. Then we'll dive a little bit deeper into that analysis, and then we'll wrap it up with some questions that I'm going to give off to you guys that you can use in discrete handling situations to sort of guide your decision making if you still walk away feeling a little bit unsure. At the very end here, I'm going to pull up a slide with some resources that you can access. Again, if you have follow-up questions or if you feel like you want to get a little bit more information. And everything that is on that slide is also going to be provided to you in the form of a resources document that will be available on our website at some point after the webinar's recording. All right, so let's dive into it with our guiding principles. Number one, and I think the thing that I want to just communicate most clearly to everyone here is that it's okay to not know. When I started out in this field, the question of glove handling, whether to use them, which ones to use, felt like this big unspoken rule, and the more established professionals around me had very strong opinions on this matter and often presented it as way more black and white than I had actually come to understand it. And that left me feeling deficient, like I was lacking really vital information, and therefore, how could I trust myself to function appropriately in this field? And the thing that I really want to perhaps shift our mindset to is this understanding that being a beginner is actually a huge asset. Being in that beginner's mindset allows you to be open-minded, to think clearly without potentially clouding of preconceived ideas about the right way to do things. And it gives us the ability to ask new and novel questions, which can open us up to new and exciting information. Second, we're going for harm reduction, not perfection. Anytime we're handling objects, there's going to be inherent risk and there's going to be inevitable damage, even if it's not necessarily visible right away. So really what we're working to do here is to minimize risk and to minimize cumulative damage over time. So we're taking a little bit of the pressure off here by understanding there is no perfect choice. There never will be. There's just what we can control. A lot of what we're going to be discussing today, I want you to understand more as guidelines than as rules. Again, this can feel a little bit scary, but it's actually an exciting opportunity to apply your knowledge, to learn more as you go. And really the goal of this webinar is to give you enough information and resources to do basic handling and to navigate the unknowns as they come up. Again, another really important here, the gloves that are available to us as options are just tools, and tools are only as good as how you use them. So we don't want to make the mistake of thinking about the gloves that are available to us as these infallible silver bullets that are going to protect both us and the object regardless, no matter what. So we're keeping in mind, what can we do to really give the tools the best chances possible to function the way they were designed? Finally, we're going to follow the science. A story I really love to tell about my dad. In his career, he was a civil engineer. At some point in his career, he was promoted to be the head of a department that was really struggling. And day one, he sat everybody down and he asked the question, how do you do things? Why do you do them that way? And your answer cannot be because they've always been done this way. And that same principle is really going to apply us here. We're going to take wisdom from established ways of doing things while also giving ourselves permission to maybe let some things go that are no longer serving us and really open ourselves up to what the science is telling us right now. So before we get into getting through the actual types of bugs we're going to be analyzing, I'm just going to pop a quick poll up. This is my first time using Zoom polls, so if you do not have access to it, please let Greg know. But I'm going to launch it right now. And what I want to know is, what type of gloves do you typically use at your institution for handling objects? We've got nitrile, latex, vinyl, cotton, bare hands, or you're in a job function that doesn't really require you to use gloves or maybe even handle objects. Okay, we've got lots of answers coming in. Thank you guys for participating. It looks like the majority of you are using nitrile gloves, cotton gloves, or your bare hands, or you're not typically using gloves. All right, that's a pretty even spread. All right, thank you guys. All right, let's get into it. So I actually think that that's a really great indicator that we're headed in the right direction here, because we are going to be talking about cotton gloves, of course, nitrile gloves, and our bare hands as our three options here today. Cotton gloves, while not currently considered the industry standard, were considered as such for a period of time and are still used in some institutions, as we can see in the survey, specifically at historic sites. You know, they tend to use cotton gloves more often than not. Nitrile gloves are included here because they are the most widely used disposable glove in this day and age. And bare hands are included because, as we are coming to understand, sometimes they are the best option in specific handling scenarios. So I also want to just address the elephant in the room here, that there are other glove options available to you besides the three that we're going to be deeply analyzing. So I just want to call out what those are and also let you know that they are going to be mentioned at some point in this webinar. They're just not going to receive the same depth of analysis as the other three options. So there's two other disposable gloves that we can consider as options for us: latex and vinyl. They're not given really the same attention here because both latex and vinyl have the tendency to degrade much faster than nitrile gloves. They're both super vulnerable to the environment that they're stored in. And with that degradation comes the concern of depositing residue on the objects. But there are specific scenarios in which they're acceptable for use as long as they're stored appropriately. So we'll get into that. Also, you may encounter situations where a more chemically resistant, thicker material might be required. And for that, we are going to look at something like butyl or neoprene, which are just synthetic rubber gloves that, again, are going to offer you a little bit more protection when you're coming up against specific chemicals or hazards. So let's get into our criteria. So we're going to analyze each of these gloves by three sets of criteria, beginning with protection and risk. So with protection, we're talking about that glove's ability to function as a physical and a chemical barrier for you and for the object. When we're talking about risk, we're talking about issues inherent to the make and material of the glove that may get in the way of your ability to safely handle whatever it is you're looking to touch. Functionality is our second set of criteria here. Functionality asks the question, considering protection and risk factors, how can this glove be used and with which objects? Finally, we'll consider sustainability, which is an increasingly important piece of criteria to consider. Here, we're talking about environmental impact and also cost, with the awareness that much of the environmental impact of the tools we use is outside of our control. You know, it gets down to manufacturing and other elements that we are not really engaging with in everyday object handling. But there are some things that we can do just in an individual decisions that we're making day to day to make a change in our specific institutions. And so we'll get a little bit into that. All right, let's get started with protection and risk. So let's start this off with just a recap of what it is that we're actually going to be looking at when we look at these two things. So again, protection, how well does this tool work as a physical and a chemical barrier between me and the object I might be handling? Second, what are some potential issues inherent to the material that could create risk scenarios for me to just keep in mind if it's something I'm going to be using? So those include the potential for that glove to snag on whatever it is that you're handling, how that material might impede your grip, how it might impede your dexterity and your touch sensitivity, the risk to deposit residue on the object that you're handling, the risk of causing allergies or skin irritation, and finally, quality control. This is especially going to come up when we get into nitrile gloves. So let's start with cotton. For each of the ones that we're going to assess here, you're going to see a table like this, pros on one side, cons on the other. Anything that you see listed on the pro side is going to indicate ways in which this particular tool functions really well under that category. Cons, some issues where it maybe doesn't function as well. So if we're looking at cotton gloves, evidence shows us that they do offer some protection for the item, specifically from dirt, oils, salts that may be on your fingertips. That said, if we look over at the con side, that protection is pretty limited. And it's not always worth the cost of keeping cotton gloves on hand. And it's not often worth the risks that are maybe inherent to their use. Similarly, and perhaps more importantly, cotton gloves offer absolutely no protection, arguably, for the handler from any potentially hazardous materials on the object. So anytime we're coming up against something like mold or arsenic or cadmium, cotton gloves are not going to offer us the type of protection that we need to safely touch that piece. Of course, there are also some risks that are inherent to the use of cotton gloves, specifically just by the weave of the fabric. There's a higher risk of depositing residue, both from your hands, because cotton gloves are porous, they are not impermeable, and from dirt that's gotten stuck in the weave. There's a risk of snagging. Of course, they are the bulkiest of the options really available to you, so that's going to impede your dexterity and touch sensitivity. And also, grip is going to be a problem. Now, that said, there are modified versions of cotton gloves that are designed to address that issue of grip, and we'll get into that. All right, let's look at nitrile. So nitrile gloves are really known for being super, super chemically stable and impermeable. So that means that in general, they're offering really high handler protection and really high item protection. There's also a super low risk of them depositing any substances onto the object because they're so chemically stable. It's also a super low allergy risk as opposed to something like latex. And they tend to offer you a better grip than something like a cotton glove. Now, on the con side of it, some things to consider. There are certain chemicals that nitrile gloves should not be used with. This is more of a consideration for conservators who are coming into prolonged contact with specific chemicals and objects. But there are scenarios where it may come up in general handling, and we'll get into those. Similarly, there are certain metals with which nitrile gloves should not be used, which we will identify specifically in a minute. And of course, there are some risks inherent to their use. Similar to cotton gloves, dexterity and touch sensitivity is impeded anytime you're going to put another barrier between your hand and the object you're touching. While allergy risk is low, skin irritation is something that can happen with specific types of nitrile gloves. And of all of the options available to us, quality control is something that is the biggest issue with nitrile gloves. So if you're somebody who is in a position to make purchasing decisions, it's something to bear in mind. Like with cotton gloves, there are variants to nitrile gloves that are out there specifically that address the issue of whether they can be used with certain metals and specifically to address the issue of skin irritation. Finally, we're looking at our bare hands. So really the biggest thing to consider in terms of your bare hands on the pro side of things is that they offer you the highest level of dexterity and touch sensitivity. So that makes them a really excellent option anytime you're handling something that falls under the category of what I'm calling the 3 Fs. So that stands for friable, meaning the object is prone to crumbling, flaking, or fragile. Anything that's falling under those categories, more often than not, is going to require that high dexterity. So if you feel confident that there is no safety concern with direct contact, it may make sense in that situation to use your bare hands. Also, because there's no material in your hands, there's no concern about grip being impeded, and there's no concern about snagging. Now, I think one of the obvious concerns here with using your bare hands is that there's absolutely no protection at all for the item from anything that might be on your hands, and there's no protection for you, the handler, from any potentially hazardous substances. And of course, there is the risk of residue deposits, again, from just dirt, oils, salts on your hands. Let's move into functionality here. So again, when we're talking about functionality, we're talking about this question of considering protection and risk factors. How can this glove be used and with which objects? For each of the options available to us, glove, nitrile, and bare hands, we're going to consider their functionality using a table that looks like this, with a yes category, a maybe category, and a no category. Any objects that are listed in the yes side, that's going to indicate that for handling that object, the glove we're considering is the best option. If it's in the maybe category, that's telling us that, yeah, this glove can be used with modifications. and or there are risks inherent to the use of this glove with this object that are potentially manageable. Objects listed in the no category, that's a situation where the option available to you offers very low or no protection, meaning that it's not really a safe option for you. So let's start with cotton. With nitrile as an option on the market, cotton really isn't considered the best, most viable object for any specific or option for any specific objects. That said, they can be used in a pinch. As I mentioned earlier, there are modified versions of cotton gloves that are designed to account for grip issues that can be used with things like ceramics, where the biggest risk is slipping and dropping it. If you are going to use cotton gloves to handle anything like textiles, metals, works on paper, books, photographs, etc., it can be done in a pinch, but again, there are risks to bear in mind that may affect your ability to use gloves as your tool there. And I just really quickly want to point out photographs. There is much debate on this particular objects because there are so many different types of photographs with very different needs and vulnerabilities. So anytime you're about to handle a photograph that you're not familiar with, particularly in terms of its materials, the year it's from, it's always best to do your research before making a decision here. Now, on the no side of things, everything you see listed is really stuff that's going to pose a threat to you. So we're talking about natural science specimens, ethnographic materials, human and animal remains, unknown or harmful substances, and plastics. So everything that's listed here are things that have a higher risk of potentially doing damage to you as the handler and where a higher level of protection is absolutely necessary. All right, moving on to nitrile gloves, we've got a really long, beautiful list here of things for which nitrile gloves are your optimal option. What I want to draw your attention to are the hazardous substances. So because they are impermeable, nitrile gloves are a viable option for handling things like mold, arsenic, lead, and cadmium that you may encounter sort of in a typical mixed collection. If we scoot over to the maybe category, you can see this term accelerator free. So it's not really important what accelerators do, but they are a substance that's used in the manufacturing of your basic nitrile glove. And they're what cause issues with handling specifically silver and copper. Their inclusion in a typical nitrile glove can cause corrosion of silver and copper objects. That is also the culprit when we're talking about skin irritation as a potential concern. The really easy way around that is to just purchase accelerator-free gloves. And in general, accelerator-free nitrile gloves do tend to perform much better overall, and there's not a huge difference in cost. Now, some things to keep in mind with nitrile gloves, there are inherent risks specifically to dexterity and touch sensitivity if you're going to be using them. So if we're looking at things like books and works on paper, which tend to have the biggest concerns with things like fragility and a gentle touch, they may not be the best option, or it's just something to bear in mind if you're going to use them. Now, for as wonderful as nitrile gloves are, there are certain situations where they are not our best option, specifically old or unidentifiable chemicals and liquids for which we may need a higher level of protection. Also, any painting that's been treated with a ketone varnish, which is most often used in mid-century paintings, and anything treated with acetone. All right, finally, let's go through our bare hands. So when we're looking at scenarios for which bare hands are your best possible option, again, we're looking at those 3 Fs. So friable, flaking, fragile, for which touch sensitivity and dexterity are most important. And most often that's going to be works on paper and books. Now, of course, there are some risks inherent to the use of your bare hands. I just want to call attention to paintings and glass specifically, just because there's that concern of maybe a varnish being used that you don't want to have on your direct hands, or a metal frame, or a risk of smudging something like glass. And then if we look over at the no section, the only things I want to call attention to, again, are instances where there's a potential hazard and we need to have a higher level of protection between you and the object. All right. So let's look at some other rules of thumb that can sort of guide us as we're considering protection, risk, and functionality before I move on to sustainability. So in general, really the best thing we can do, regardless of the tools we use, is to minimize handling. So 9 times out of 10, when you're going into a handling scenario, you can't change the reality that it's going to have to go from one location to another. What you can do is work to make sure the destination station, so the workstation, wherever it is that you're headed, is set up in such a way to minimize future need for handling once you get there. It's also really good to go into handling scenarios knowing your intentions. Specifically, how regularly do you anticipate that you're going to need to handle this object, and for how long will you need to be in contact with it? Both of these things should really guide you towards, should really guide your thinking about the type of object or glove that you want to use to handle that object, specifically if we're talking about something like a cotton glove versus a nitrile glove. Always have a backup plan. So this is just the way of life, right? The best laid plans. So it's very possible that you'll get into a handling scenario and the glove that you've chosen is not performing the way that you thought it might. It's really good to know what your next best option is and have it within reach. So either it's at your workstation with you or it's in your back pocket. Record and report, my 2 favorite words. So anytime that you're going into a handling situation, you want to be recording that and reporting any damage done. And this is really just so we can have a paper trail of any potential cumulative damage, and also so that anyone who's coming after you to handle that object has a record of, well, this worked, this didn't, and that can help guide their decision-making when they decide how to handle that piece. We also want to know our glove and give it the best chance to work. This goes back again to that idea that these are not infallible tools. There are fallibilities to be mindful of, and there are things that we can do to give these tools the best chance to work properly. When we're talking about cotton gloves, that means regular washing. About every 4th use is appropriate, unless you're regularly working with objects that are of different materials, in which case you may want to do more regular washing. With nitrile gloves, a really great way to get optimum performance is to purchase accelerator free. Like we mentioned earlier, they're much more versatile and they do tend to perform better overall. And then regardless of what you're using, even if you are using gloves, we always want to be washing our hands. Research tells us that even if we are wearing gloves, the risk of depositing dirt from your hands onto whatever it is that you're touching lowers dramatically if you've washed your hands before you've put those gloves on. Finally, we want to know our vendor. And again, this is really speaking to people who are in positions where they're making purchasing decisions. The manufacturing processes that goes into making different types of nitrile gloves are subject to change at any time by the manufacturers who are doing that kind of work. And that's specifically an issue if we're purchasing from a third-party vendor. So it's really important to stay on top of any new research that's coming out about how well different manufacturers gloves are functioning. And in that resources document that will be made available to all of you, there are studies that you can access that give you some specific suggestions for where you can go for really reliable vendors. So before we move into sustainability, let's do some real quick what if scenarios. And this is where we're going to maybe talk about some of those other glove options and when they might come in and really specialized handling scenarios. So let's say that you are in a situation that requires super high touch sensitivity, but you're not feeling super comfortable using your bare hands. You want a little bit extra protection. In those scenarios, there are latex and nitrile variants that are appropriate for use. Again, bearing in mind that latex does have that tendency to degrade, so they need to be stored in a cool, dry place. Similarly, let's say you need reliable grip, the way that maybe your bare hands might afford you, but you're not feeling comfortable using your bare hands. There are cotton and nitrile variants that are designed to maximize grip, and neoprene may also be a really great option here. Biggest concern here, let's say you're coming up against an old or unknown liquid or chemical. In these situations, you're going to want that extra layer of protection, you're going to want those chemically resistant gloves. So this is where we want butyl or neoprene. Finally, let's say funding is a really serious concern for you. You don't have the capacity to be purchasing nitrile gloves regularly. In that situation, vinyl gloves are an option that's available to you. They function very similarly to nitrile gloves, just again, bearing in mind the tendency that they have to degrade. So if you're going to have them as an option on hand, we want to be really mindful about how we're storing them. All right, moving on to sustainability. So I've got another poll for you guys. Just sort of taking the pulse on how we feel about how each of these options available to us might function in terms of environmental impact. So the question we're asking you here is, between cotton gloves and nitrile gloves, which type of glove do you believe has the lower environmental impact? Are you all able to access this? It looks like I'm having a little issues with it. Greg, do you see anything in the chat about?
Yeah, no one's seeing the poll.
It's strange. All right, type your answers in the chat if you're willing to do it. It looks like this poll is giving us some problems. Greg, if you'll just tell me what people are saying, read it off to me.
I mean, we're getting a strong push for cotton.
Okay.
There's a couple nitriles, but it looks like most people are saying cotton, or about the same. There's some about the same.
Okay, cool. So I'm going to burst some bubbles. We're going to do a little myth busting getting into this, which is totally fine. Remember, it's okay to not know. As we're getting into sustainability, just some things to bear in mind. So we're going to be considering things like environmental impact. Specifically, we're going to be looking at disposal and use, because those tend to be the two places where we have the most pull and the most ability to make some changes in terms of our own decision making. We're also going to be considering feasibility. Here we're specifically looking at disposal. Often that is really touted as the place where we can make the most impact, but the reality of the situation is that changes that can be made in terms of types of disposal, method of disposal, specifically recycling, often aren't things that are financially feasible for most institutions. So we'll bear that in mind with any recommendations that we're making here. Last thing we want to consider is cost, and we're really not going to go any deeper than this. In general, just so you have this information, typically cotton gloves average at about $3 per pair. Nitrile gloves average at about 28 cents per pair, and they're usually sold in packs of 100 or 200. In general, for most institutions, this doesn't add up to big enough of a change in cost to really be a huge factor in your decision making. But it's just here for you to have it as that piece of information. All right, good. So most of the considerations that we're going to take into account here for sustainability come from this really excellent, super recent study done by the Foundation for Advancement in Conservation's STITCH initiative, which publishes research on sustainability tools in cultural heritage work. So we've got these two graphs in front of us. What are we looking at? So what these two graphs are showing us is the overall carbon emissions for nitrile, latex, and cotton gloves through the entirety of their life cycle. So we're talking from material cultivation all the way to disposal. The first graph shows us those emissions if we are assuming that each pair of gloves is used once and then discarded. The second graph is adjusted for the common practice of cotton glove reuse, specifically 40 times reused before disposal and washed every fourth use. So just a few things that I want to point out here on these graphs. First is that natural latex performs best because it is biodegradable, though the difference overall between it and nitrile is relatively minimal. The second thing I want to point out, and you can really see this more on the second graph, is that although disposal is touted as being the most important element often in emissions, it actually has the least impact here if we look at the entirety of the life cycle. Also, like we said earlier, keeping feasibility in mind, the resources required to conduct truly impactful recycling are most often financially out of the realm of possibility for most institutions. Finally, perhaps the starkest thing here is the difference in carbon emissions between single use for cotton gloves and reuse. On that first graph, we can see that their emissions are all the way up at 889 if they're only used once, and they knock all the way down to 27 if we're reusing them 40 times. So for cotton gloves, reuse is really critical if they're going to be considered an environmentally friendly option. All right, second thing here. So this is showing us data from the same study, except we're looking at relative comparisons per glove across all environmental impact categories. And really the thing that I just want to illustrate here is that overall, nitrile gloves generally perform best across all environmental impact categories. So some things that were taken away from this conversation around sustainability. First is that overall, nitrile gloves are preferred. And disposal often has pretty minimal impact in terms of what we are able to do. One thing that I do want to make you all aware of is that biodegradable nitrile gloves are available on the market. They tend to be a little bit more expensive than untreated nitrile gloves or even accelerator-free nitrile gloves, but they are available if that's something you have the capacity to purchase. Looking at use, which is the other place where we have maybe a little bit of freedom to make some changes, specifically the concept of reuse. I just want to drive home this idea that you can reuse your nitrile gloves. I know that can feel like a little bit of a crazy concept because they are designed to be disposable. But if you have a situation where you're handling two objects of like material, that may be a situation where you can judiciously make a choice to reuse if it feels safe for the object. Looking at cotton, really reuse is absolutely vital if cotton gloves are going to be considered an environmentally friendly and feasible option here. And that's really the point that I want to drive home, specifically with cotton gloves. Finally, considering feasibility, feasibly within the realm of what we can do as people who are handling objects is really to reduce our overall use, whether that's through reuse, whether that's through reworking your process to allow for reuse, or even accepting that there are situations where you can safely go glove-free and choosing to do so. Last thing we know for sure is that cost really does have such a negligible impact in terms of difference of the cost output required to keep a glove stock going. But in general, cotton gloves, if we do want to look at that difference, cotton gloves do tend to require a little bit less of a financial output, and vinyl gloves are our absolute least expensive option. All right, so I'm going to put forth this series of questions now, just keeping in mind that even if you walk out of this webinar and you have all this information in your head, and it's possible that you may come up against some discrete handling scenarios where that information isn't really clearly guiding you towards a decision in terms of how you want to handle an object. So the idea is here that you can ask yourself these questions, and all together they should work to guide you toward a decision that you can feel confident in, bearing in mind that it's not going to be the perfect choice. It's never going to be the perfect choice, and that's okay. So number one, we want to ask ourselves, what are the relative risks of hand exposure versus dexterity loss? We might also ask ourselves, how might the substances on my hands negatively impact the piece? Conversely, how confident am I that the piece is safe to touch for me? So how might I be impacted by those materials? How might the gloves material interact with the object material? Again, calling back to this question of risk. What is my biggest concern in handling this piece? So what is my priority that everything needs to work to support or consider? And finally, what do I plan to do with this piece and how long will it take? And altogether, these 6 questions, combined with the information that you have, should help you make a really confident decision. That said, if at the end of the day, you're still wanting a little bit more information, you still have questions that maybe we aren't able to answer for you here, There are some really fantastic resources out there online. The resources put forth by the National Park Service, Sustainable Museums, and Stitch, those are all super free to access. Stitch is specifically going to be giving you more information about sustainability. The NPS has this really fantastic conservagram that's been out and available for years that does a really accessible and user-friendly breakdown of your options. And of course, AAM is always putting out fantastic resources, just bearing in mind that a lot of their stuff is behind a paywall. And of course, you can always ask a conservator. There is nobody who knows better what your options are in terms of safe handling than a conservator. So always feel free to reach out to one if you know one. And remember that all of these are going to be made available to you on the document after the webinar, in addition to other resources that may be helpful for you. So that's it. We're going to wrap it up there. And then I'm happy to take any questions that have been put forth for Greg. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Katie. We already have some great questions in the chat. So I'm just gonna kind of go in order here. So we have a participant who's saying, hello, we use cotton gloves for all of our artifacts at a military museum. We handle a lot of metals, paper and photos regularly. I noticed that the gloves get brown stains on them over time. Is this from the objects or the combo of that and hand oils? That's the first question.
It's a really good question. I think I would ask the question of how regularly the objects you're using are being cleaned, because if there's not a super regular cleaning schedule, I think that increases the possibility that it's likely coming from the objects that you're handling. If I can ask a follow-up question, are you washing your gloves regularly?
So that is actually a follow-up question, Katie, from the same person.
Okay.
I'm also responsible for washing the cotton gloves. I researched that tied on gentle cycle was acceptable for washing them. Is this the best method?
I would say yes. I mean, occasionally, if you're having issues with consistent staining, you may want to do something like a deep cycle wash, just bearing in mind that that is going to increase the risk of the glove degrading and maybe having lint deposits. But in general, yes, a gentle cycle is good. We want to use unscented detergents, which it sounds like you're doing. That's right. Yep. Somebody's in there saying dye and fragrance free for sure. That's something we want to be doing. I think it's more probable that those stains are coming from whatever it is that you're handling, though it could also be just really deeply ingrained materials from your hands. And I would just keep an eye on it and make sure that you're not seeing whatever that is transferring to the objects, and maybe practice more regular washing, or it might be a situation where you have to more regularly replace the gloves that you have.
Thank you. We have another question. Can you wash nitrile gloves with soap and water and reuse them once dried?
Oh, I have never considered that question. My gut is saying no. That's something that I could research and get back to this person about. I'm also curious to know if maybe there's anybody else in the chat who has done that and has any insight into whether it works. I certainly think if you were to do it, cold water would be your best option. I wouldn't do that in a warm or a hot cycle. And my gut says no.
Tricky questions, everybody. Okay. Vendor lists. What are some vendors that are considered good for nitrile gloves right now?
Really good question. So I can't say the ones that have performed well in the studies that I've read on this webinar, but there will be resources available to you on the document that we're going to give out afterwards. You can read the research directly, and manufacturers and vendors are named that performed really well.
Thank you, Katie. Yes, that's a good point. Let's see here. I'm trying to sift through some of the questions. Oh, here's one. This is a good one. I've wondered this myself sometimes. Does the color of the glove indicate a specific feature, or is it just a matter of taste?
Not as far as I've seen. I will say, without naming a manufacturer, in the research that I read, there was a brand that manufactures white nitrile gloves that performed really well, and I think best overall, if I'm remembering correctly. Really, the the benefit to having a colored nitrile glove, and Greg and I have talked about this, is that regardless of your skin tone, you can see tears really easily.
Thank you. I know you said that glove options for photographs depend on photograph materials. Are there general guidelines, or if that's too complicated, what's a good resource to learn more?
Yeah, that is a really complicated question, and it's better to just have access to research and resources. I know that CCAHA has put out technical bulletins in the past about different types of photographs and their handling requirements. I will make sure that that gets included in the resources document, and that's written in a super accessible way that you can just have open and reference as you're looking through the stuff that you have in your collection. But I will say in general, you want to be using gloves if you're handling anything that is glass plated with photographs. That is a hard and fast rule.
Cool. And Katie, we'll save the chat too, because there's someone who's recommending a great article from 2021 about gloves. So some more research for us to share with everybody.
Wonderful.
Okay, here's another question I'm seeing. Is there a difference in accelerator-free nitrile gloves and powder-free? You were helping me clarify this a little bit, Katie, this difference.
Yeah, so I mean, you can get powder-free and accelerator-free. Those are sort of doing two different things, though. They're referring to two different things. So powder-free gloves, first of all, we never want to use powdered nitrile gloves just because there's the risk of depositing whatever that residue is onto what you're handling. The problem with powder-free gloves is that, so the powder exists to make the glove easier to put on and take off. And powder-free gloves have been manufactured in such a way that they're a little bit looser fit on the hand so that you don't have the issues with putting them on and taking them off, which of course presents a snag risk. So everything that we're using in artifact handling is going to be powder-free. Accelerator-free nitrile gloves, again, that's doing a completely different thing. That's more about like specific safety with versatility of objects that we're handling, and it's more about reducing the risk of skin irritation. So they're doing two different things, and every option available to you is going to be powder-free, regardless of whether or not it's accelerator-free.
Cool. We have another great question, which is, how would you know when to throw away the unused gloves that you've stored for a long time?
There's always going to be information about that from the manufacturer. So there's always going to be guidance from the manufacturer, just sort of the shelf life of the gloves that you're using. In general, it's pretty easy to see if a latex or a vinyl glove has started to degrade. But I wouldn't give any general guidelines there. I would say look at what the manufacturer is recommending. And especially be especially vigilant if you're storing them in a non-climate controlled area. But nitrile gloves have a super long shelf life.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, this gets back to your point, Katie, about sort of like planning and writing things down, like keeping that good inventory so you know when you bought those gloves.
Yeah.
I think maybe that's part of the question too. I'm just kind of going in order here. We have so many great questions. If artifacts are dirty, what can be done to lessen transfer of deposits to other artifacts handled by the glove? Is there such thing as artifact cleaning? That's interesting.
Yes, there is. Yeah. So there are safe ways to regularly clean a lot of artifacts. Some of that should be done by conservators. Some of it can be safely done just by people who are responsible for collections handling in their institutions. Again, CCAHA does have tech bulletins that are available that give you guidelines on what you can safely clean yourself and how to do that and what substances are and are not appropriate. But if you haven't done any cleaning or you've yet to do cleaning and you need to move these objects that may be dirty or have residue on them, the best thing to just do is to switch out your gloves between one object and the other.
Cool. Could you talk a little bit more about the effects of nitrile gloves on silver and copper? And a little bit more about accelerator-free gloves, like what they are.
Yeah, so simply put, accelerators are just a substance that's used in the manufacturing of nitrile gloves to precipitate a chemical process. So they help with ease of manufacturing, but the chemicals that act as accelerators react negatively with the properties of silver and copper, which can lead to them, if you're touching a silver and a copper object with nitrile gloves that were manufactured with accelerators, there's a higher risk of corrosion. So taking the accelerators out just takes away that risk of corrosion. That's all.
Sorry, just filter. Oh, okay. This is an interesting one. I think we were getting, if I understand this question right, I think it was getting maybe to some of the conversation Katie and you and I were having around the sort of perception of cotton gloves, right?
Oh,
so any comments on TV producers and their preferred use of cotton gloves in cultural heritage?
yes.
I think that's what that asks, unless there's something specific with like TV production that I'm not aware of and cotton gloves. But I think that's more about like the visible nature of cotton.
We as a staff have had so many conversations about this in the last week or so, because it is a frustrating thing to see. Not only is it perpetuating misinformation, but it's also perpetuating, sorry, very loud sirens going past. It's also perpetuating an image that no longer feels helpful or acceptable in the museum field these days. So when we think about what cotton gloves communicate to people, it's sort of like the white coat situation. You see somebody wearing cotton gloves and you think, that's a pro, that's an expert, that person has studied. And so I think in some ways that's good, right? Like it's a really easy shorthand of communicating safety and expertise. On the flip side of that, is it creating a scenario where maybe content where cotton gloves are featured feels a little bit inaccessible, feels a little bit elitist, feels a little bit, the term that I always use is like White Castle, like this is not accessible to you, the common person. And that's not really how we want to be operating as a field right now. And that's the conversations that we're having. We're like, how can we make information available and accessible to people without communicating misinformation and also just an inappropriate level of inaccessibility? Because really this knowledge is for everybody. That's my thoughts on it. It's frustrating. I think in film and media, it's just a shorthand to show, hey, this is someone who works in museums. This is a conservator. And it's, I think, unknowingly by them perpetuating misinformation, which is frustrating.
We're getting lots of opinions on a certain road show that is on TV in the comments. That's kind of interesting. We have another question here. My main concern about using gloves in processing archival collections is the accumulation of dust, which tend to be noticeable when handling materials barehandedly, which over time gets smeared over the materials. I think this is a little bit similar to that question about sort of like cleaning, but dust is a little different, this isn't, well, but then the question is also asking about standards requiring the use of gloves when handling art or archival materials. I guess maybe in this case, maybe I'm wondering if we walk through some of your question flow charts a little bit on this, Katie, like, because I don't know if there's a specific answer to this question when you have something with a lot of dust, like.
Yeah, I mean, I think just if we're talking preventatively, like how to avoid that situation, again, goes back to a regular practice of cleaning your storage areas. But it sounds like what you're talking about is a situation where an object or archival material is not kept in a box and is therefore getting covered in dust directly. Again, there are instances where you can safely practice the cleaning of your own collection. I think dust is different, but the practice still stands of if you're handling two different objects and maybe one is covered in dust and one is not, to just switch the gloves out from one to the other, which again gets to this issue of sustainability. We want to keep sustainability in mind, but the reality is we still have to do our jobs, and it's about being mindful and doing what we can do to make sustainable choices while also giving ourselves a little grace and understanding that we're doing a lot of work, we're doing a lot of hard work. We can't always keep sustainability in mind to the extent that we want to. One day we will, but that's not always the case for everybody and in every situation. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah. I think some of the questions, hopefully some of the very specific questions people have about materials, I think should be covered in some of the resources that we're giving. So I don't want to like shortchange any of those questions that are very specific, but hopefully we have some good resources for you if you have those. But I'm trying to get to some of the bigger issue questions here, just so that we can get, enough time today, because we still have so many questions and it's almost 1. Do you have advice on advocating for conscientious use of gloves or bare hands to higher up folks who still have very black and white views on certain glove usage? I think this is more of an advocacy question rather than like a specific materials question.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think the thing to be mindful of is that when we ask people to change their minds and to change their practices, sometimes there's more going on there than just the practice itself. Humans are complicated. A lot of us who are in this field have our identities wrapped up in our level of expertise and in the work that we do. So maybe there's an emotional element to having your understanding of things called into question. So I think anytime you're going to have a difficult conversation where maybe you need to educate another person or ask them to consider alternatives or ask them to try to change their mind, it's always good to go into it asking questions first. So really going to that person and saying, talk to me a little bit about how you've reached your understanding that this is the best practice. I really want to hear from you, what your logic is, what your wisdom is here, and having it be a collaborative conversation as opposed to just information dumping. And knowing that person well enough to know what information is maybe going to help them change their mind. So going into it without the intent to shame, with empathy, with curiosity, and just enough of the right facts to maybe help push them over the edge within like a safe and accessible conversation. But that's difficult. I mean, it's difficult to get people to change their minds, especially if financial output is required in that change. But no, you're not alone with that question. I mean, that's really getting at like the nature of humanity.
Yeah, which maybe we don't have time to answer
today.
And with that, actually, speaking of, I think there's so many questions in the chat, but I think we need to wrap up. So if you do have specific questions, you can feel free to reach out to us. And again, we're going to share a lot of the resources that Katie mentioned, which I think can hopefully help answer some of those specific materials questions. But I just wanted to say a big thank you to you, Katie, for this very informative talk today. I also want to thank Camilla Dawson, who's been behind the scenes with all the tech and support for today's webinar. Thank you to the National Endowment for the Humanities, the William Penn Foundation, and the Independence Foundation again for their support, and to all of you for showing up today. So our next webinar is going to be titled DIY Preservation from Monitoring to Management with Melanie Bump, who is the curator of collections and exhibitions at the Division of Cultural and Environmental Resources at the Morris County Parks Commission. And she's going to be talking about a really exciting recent project that we partnered with them on. And this will be on August 23rd at 12 p.m. We hope to see you there. And when this program ends, there's going to be a little survey that will pop up as soon as your window closes. And we would kindly ask that you fill that out to let us know how we're doing. Thank you so much, everybody, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon.
Thank you all for being here. Bye-bye.